I never thought that inheriting the old family home in the far reaches of the UK countryside would put everything I loved at risk. When I received the news of the inheritance, I was sitting in the stuffy office of my London home, drowning in piles of paperwork and bills to pay. The call was a welcome escape, a breath of fresh air, but with a weight that I would only come to understand later. The lawyer told me it was an isolated property, neglected for decades, now rightfully mine. My wife, Mary, was reluctant from the start. She had always had an intuition for the supernatural, a sixth sense that I, skeptical to the bone, dismissed as superstition. It only took us a few weeks to move in. I saw it as a fresh start, a new life away from the urban chaos, where our daughter Emily could run free in the fields and explore the woods, away from screens and pollution. When we arrived, we were greeted with curious looks and a few closed expressions. The locals murmured among themselves, casting glances in our direction that I interpreted as a simple fear of strangers. The house was a monument to time, with its worn stones and wild garden. Inside, every room told stories of a forgotten era, and the attic, locked and mysterious, seemed to hold the darkest secrets. In the early days, while we were unpacking and settling in, Mary found among the dusty books in the library some amulets and small objects with symbols that not even the internet could decipher. She showed them to me, worried, but my response was to laugh and suggest that perhaps they just decorated the shelves of some eccentric former resident. I was wrong. We would soon learn that certain things are best left alone, especially when you're standing on ground that breathes and murmurs with the weight of a story never told. The house was not just a home, but a sanctuary of ancient mysteries and possibly a portal to something much older and hungrier. And so it was that, in an attempt to start again, we inadvertently opened the door to our own nightmare. At first, they were just strange little things that you could dismiss as the result of tiredness or the stress of moving. Emily, our daughter, started talking to her imaginary friends. At first glance, it seemed normal. Children have fertile imaginations. But there was something about the details she described, something a little peculiar. She talked about a girl in a white dress with sad eyes who lived in the attic, a friendship that became her routine. I could hear their conversations, laughter mixed with almost inaudible whispers coming from the top of the house. As the weeks went by, the house began to manifest itself. At night, inexplicable sounds drifted through the corridors. They were footsteps, light knocks on the walls, as if someone or something was exploring the dark corners together with us. On several nights, I woke up to the sound of scratches on the wooden floor of our room. Mary heard the same, and each night brought us more unease, a growing sense that we weren't alone. Objects also seemed to have a life of their own. Pictures that changed places, books that fell off the shelves without anyone around, candles that went out without a draft. Mary tried to convince me that something wasn't right, that perhaps the previous residents had left more than just physical belongings. I, trying to keep a rational view of things, attributed everything to the wind, the damp, or the old age of the house. But then things took a turn that not even my skepticism could ignore. The village itself began to feel the effects of our presence in that house. Pets disappeared without a trace, and at night shadows moved through the streets as if the darkness had come to life. The locals spoke of a curse, whispering that we had awakened something dormant. The atmosphere of the place became heavy, charged with a silent terror that even skeptics like me could no longer deny. On one of those days, as I walked through the village trying to better understand the place we now called home, I was approached by one of the village elders, Mr. Hawthorne. He met me near the old church, a building as old as the mysteries surrounding our house. With a grave expression and penetrating gaze, he said to me in a low, trembling voice, "You don't know what you've awakened, Mr. John. This house, it has deeper and darker roots than you can imagine. Respect the old superstitions They were put there to protect us. I, still skeptical, smiled politely and thanked him for his advice, but internally dismissed his words as the result of old local legends nurtured by generations of isolation and fear. How could simple superstitions have any real influence on the concrete and tangible? Nevertheless, that encounter left me uncomfortably alert, a seed of doubt planted firmly in my mind. Over the next few days, the oppression in our house seemed to grow, as if Mr. Hawthorne's warning had somehow intensified the presence that dwelled there. Mary began to spend hours researching the house and the village, leafing through old books and diaries that she found hidden on the shelves of the library. It was in one of these diaries, bound in leather and covered in dust, that she discovered something alarming. The diary had belonged to a former resident of the house, who had written in detail about macabre rituals and ceremonies performed there, as attempts to contact and placate certain entities. From that moment on, the atmosphere inside the house became even more suffocating. The nights were filled with a heavy, almost physical silence, punctuated only by the distant whispers and cries that seemed to emanate from the walls. And on some nights, the air became so thick that it seemed difficult to breathe, as if the house itself was suffocating us with ancient secrets and forgotten horrors. Mr. Hawthorne's warning, the whispers of the shadows, and the mysterious diary all converged on one undeniable truth. We had unearthed something that should have remained hidden. Now every dark corner of that house seemed to be watching. Every shadow whispered with the voice of times long past. And every quiet moment was only the prelude to something terrible to come. The situation began to deteriorate rapidly after those discoveries. One particularly stormy night became the stage for an experience that would change our perception of reality forever. The storm cut through the sky with lightning, and the wind howled as if bringing with it voices from the past. And it was that night, with the house encased by the storm, that we lost all electricity. The lights flickered one last time before leaving us at the mercy of total darkness. Lanterns and candles barely illuminated the corridors, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock our situation. That night, the sounds that disturbed us so much intensified. Whispers turned into muffled screams, coming from all directions, but with no discernible source. They seemed to be inside the walls, under the floor, above us on the ceiling. Mary and I clung to each other, trying to find comfort in each other's presence as the screams grew in desperation and pain. They were no longer just noises. They were voices calling for help, calling out names, our names. In a desperate attempt to find a logical explanation, I went to check the mirrors in the house, because Mary insisted that she had seen reflections that didn't correspond to reality. What I saw in the mirrors were not our reflections, but distorted and disturbing images. Faces contorted into expressions of horror. Figures that didn't belong in our world stared back at us, their features changing with every glance. And then our daughter Emily, who until that moment had been spared the most intense manifestations, began to show signs of a sudden and inexplicable illness. She woke up from her sleep screaming, her body shaking uncontrollably. We took her to the village doctor the next day, but he couldn't diagnose her condition. He spoke of fever, of infection, but his eyes, full of fear, did not hide his true belief. This was no ordinary illness. Emily spoke of dreams, said that the girl in the attic visited her, and that she didn't want to be alone anymore. That week, the house seemed alive, pulsing with an ancient evil energy. Every dark corner seemed to hide a terrible secret. Every nocturnal whisper was an invitation to look into the shadows and see what lurked there. The reality I knew was crumbling, and with it, my resistance to believing that something beyond comprehension was happening in our new home. As the days dragged on, despair took hold of us, especially Mary. She, who had always been more sensitive to her surroundings, began to be consumed by nightmares so vivid that she would often wake up screaming, bathed in sweat. In her dreams, she saw the former inhabitants of the house, shadowy figures wrapped in cloaks, practicing dark rituals and invoking things that should not be disturbed. These nocturnal visions began to leave physical marks. Small scratches and bruises appeared on her body, as if the dreams were crossing the imaginary barrier. As Emily's situation worsened and Mary's dreams intensified, my wife became a shadow of her former self, pale and frightened. She insisted that we needed to leave the house, that there was something intrinsically evil there that couldn't be ignored. I saw the logic in her words, but a part of me still struggled to accept that the solution was simply to run away, to leave behind the inheritance that I thought was our salvation. My reluctance to leave the house frustrated Mary, but she knew something had to be done. On one of the darkest afternoons, while Emily was resting, Mary happened to find, behind a layer of peeling paint in our daughter's room, ancient symbols of protection. They were strange engravings secretly marked on the wood of the walls, intentionally covered by layers of paint over the years. The discovery of these symbols gave us a glimmer of hope, perhaps a way to at least protect Emily from the forces that seemed to want to take hold of her. Inspired by this discovery and driven by a maternal desperation, Mary began to reproduce these symbols all over the house, a frantic effort to safeguard our family. She would spend hours in silence, tracing each line with obsessive precision while I watched, torn between admiration for her determination and fear of what might happen if she failed. Each symbol she drew seemed to strengthen the barrier between us a little, and the evil we felt intensifying around us. Those days were marked by a silent and constant struggle, a battle between Mary's hope of protecting our family and the growing evil presence within our home. With each symbol drawn, we seemed to be able to breathe a little easier, but the sense of security was always temporary, always on the verge of being shattered by new manifestations of terror. That night, the stormiest of the year, would become a memory forever etched in my mind. The sky was a chaos of dark clouds and lightning that illuminated the house at irregular intervals, while the wind howled with a fury that seemed to want to tear the house itself from its foundations. Inside the house, every door and window seemed to take on a life of its own, slamming and locking tightly under an invisible force. We were separated by these manifestations, Mary in Emily's room and me trapped in the library. The shadows on the walls began to move, as if they were made of something denser than darkness. Pale figures, just visible out of the corner of my eye, moved silently down the corridor. I could hear Mary calling out to me, her voice muffled by the sound of the storm and the growing noise inside the house. Trying to reach her, I found that the doors wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I tried to force them. As I struggled to get out of the library, I stumbled over one of the fallen books, the diary Mary had found. The open page described a ritual, supposedly capable of purifying the house and ending the curse. The text spoke of a sacrifice, something to be offered in exchange for peace. The desperation and irrationality of the situation led me to consider this as a possible solution, even though I knew deep down that it could be just another layer of the madness that was enveloping us. Mary, for her part, defended Emily with a maternal ferocity, oblivious to the dangers around her. The girl screamed, trapped in a waking nightmare, while her mother traced the last symbols of protection around her bed. I could hear the sound of something scratching the walls outside her room, as if huge claws were trying to get in. The tension that night seemed to reach an unbearable peak, where every second stretched into an eternity. Our voices eventually got lost in each other, drowned out by the storm and the increasingly aggressive sounds of the house. The figures in the shadows were now almost palpable, an overwhelming presence that enveloped us in fear and despair. It was as if the house itself was breathing with the storm, each breath coming closer to consuming us completely. That night, under the weight of an almost palpable hopelessness, I made the decision to try the ritual described in the old diary. With the house echoing with supernatural noises and moans, my every step towards the attic, the heart of the house's paranormal activity, was accompanied by a growing sense of dread. The wind outside roared with a fury that seemed to want to swallow everything, while I dragged with me the few ingredients that the ritual required. Simple things that we had in the house that were now becoming components of a desperate act. When I reached the attic, the air was cold and dense, as if the atmosphere itself rejected my presence. I lit a candle, which flickered violently despite the absence of airflow, and began to trace the protective circle on the dusty floor as instructed by the diary. Each line drawn was a silent plea for protection, a mute cry for it all to end. Meanwhile, Mary, in an act of maternal protection, surrounded Emily with more symbols of protection, her voice reciting words of comfort that barely managed to override the frightening sounds of the house. The fear in her eyes was crystal clear, but her determination to protect our daughter made her unwavering. She was fighting a battle of her own in Emily's room, trying to keep her sanity as the reality around her disintegrated. Back in the attic, I finished the circle and began the ritual itself. The words of the incantation seemed to echo in the shadows, distorting and becoming almost unintelligible. The house reacted. The walls began to vibrate slightly. A sound like a heart beating fast and hard began to fill the room, growing, threatening. I could feel a resistance, as if something very ancient and powerful was daring me to continue. When the ritual reached its climax, the reaction was instantaneous and terrible. The candle went out as if a gust of icy wind had invaded the attic, and a deafening roar filled the space, a sound no human being should hear. The darkness thickened, seeming to take on substance and form, moving towards me with palpable malevolence. At that moment, I realized that the sacrifice demanded by the ritual was something I could never have foreseen, and that the true cost of our attempt to escape could be much higher than we were willing to pay. At that critical moment, at the end of the ritual, the true nature of the sacrifice revealed itself clearly and brutally. It was a price I was not prepared to pay, a personal and devastating cost that left me paralyzed with horror. The deafening sound gradually turned into an oppressive silence, and the darkness slowly dissipated, leaving behind only the echo of its threat. I was alone in the attic, the chill of dawn mixing with the emptiness that now filled the space. I descended from the attic, the weight of my choice, not to complete the sacrifice, weighing on every step. When I found Mary, I saw the result of my decision reflected in her face, marked by terror and pain. She was standing next to Emily's bed, whose eyes, once full of life and curiosity, now showed only a deep emptiness. Emily was no longer with us as before. Something essential of her had been lost, as if the very essence of her soul had been torn away. Mary, with tears streaking her face, could barely speak. Her expression was that of a mother who had fought with all her might, but still found herself defeated. The terror of that night had left deep physical and emotional scars on us. She was wounded, not only spiritually, but also physically, with cuts and bruises that seemed to have been inflicted by a brutal, invisible force. In the days that followed, the silence in our house was of a different kind. A silence of mourning and loss. Emily no longer spoke, nor did she respond to our calls. Her gaze was often turned to some distant point, as if observing something we couldn't see. Our lives had been irrevocably altered. The house, although free of the palpable oppression of before, still carried echoes of the horrors we had faced. It was as if every corner still whispered about what had happened, every shadow hiding a painful memory. Pain and guilt consumed me, knowing that my inability to carry out the sacrifice had cost something priceless. Mary and I barely spoke about what had happened. Words seemed inadequate to express the chasm that now existed between us. The village, once a place of curiosity and mystery, was now just a constant reminder of the price of ignoring the warnings we had received. The dawn after that terrible night brought with it a sepulchral silence. The sky cleared slowly, bathing the house in a pale light that somehow seemed unable to completely penetrate the darkness that had settled over our home. Mary and I, exhausted and scarred by the night of horror, could barely look at each other. The decision to leave the house and the village, although late, was made with a few words. We knew there was nothing that could be done to repair or redeem what had happened. As we packed our things, the silence between us was a mute testimony to the shared pain. Emily, still lost in her own silent world, was a constant reminder of the cost of our choices. The house, once full of possibilities and promise, now seemed to watch our movements with a kind of somber sadness, its walls marked by the shadows of the recent past. The decision to leave everything behind was painful but necessary. Carrying only the essentials, we left the house in the growing light of day. As we walked away, there was no looking back. Each step took us further away from a nightmare we would rather forget. The town, with its empty streets and curious looks, now seemed like a specter of its former self, burdened with the memory of our mistakes. The following days were a blur of temporary accommodations and vain attempts to return to normality. Emily remained distant, her condition a constant reminder of our failure. Mary and I, although physically together, were hopelessly separated by the weight of remorse and guilt. Our health, shaken by stress and terror, began to deteriorate. Each night brought disturbing dreams, remnants of that final night in the house. Time passed, but the shadow of that house in our lives only seemed to deepen. Our days were marked by a silent sadness and an inability to look to the future with any hope. The house, although physically distant, remained with us, a constant ghost in our muted conversations and in our wounded hearts. In the months that followed our escape from the house, the weight of our experience continued to manifest itself in ways that not even distance could alleviate. Mary's health deteriorated rapidly. Her nights were haunted by nightmares, and her waking hours consumed by a deep melancholy. Her body and mind, both marked by the invisible scars of our time in that house, slowly made her less present in our daily lives. I, for my part, found myself trapped in a cycle of guilt and remorse. The memory of that last night in the house, of the choices I made and the ones I avoided, haunted me incessantly. Emily's face, empty of emotion and recognition, was a constant reminder of the price my family had paid for my disbelief and hesitation. The relationship with my daughter, now silently distorted, became a daily reminder of everything we had lost. Although we had physically left the village and the house, reports of unexplained phenomena continued to emerge from the place. New residents and curious visitors reported shadows on the windows and voices in the wind, as if the house refused to be forgotten or ignored. These reports reached us, each one reopening the wounds we were desperately trying to heal. The outcome of our story, rather than bringing closure, left only a series of unanswered questions and open scars. The house remained, an emptiness waiting for new residents or victims, with the echoes of the terrors we faced still resonating in its old walls. The memory of what we experienced continues to define our days, a shadow that, despite efforts to escape, stretches long and cold across our lives. This is the story of how an inheritance turned into a nightmare, of how the unknown that dwells in the dark corners of the world can, when disturbed, reach those bold or foolish enough to ignore the warnings we are given. Our future, once full of hope and possibility, is now just a dark echo of the past, a constant reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed. I hope that my account can serve as a warning to others who may face similar choices, so that they can learn from our mistakes before being consumed by the shadows we have awakened.